Woo, doesn't that get you excited? Black Panther. How many of us have seen that movie? Anybody? Yeah? Pretty good crew. Pretty good crew. It's usually about half in each of the services this morning. It's a fun movie, right? And it's a part of this greater picture called Marvel Cinematic Universe. You guys know that? How many of you are fans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe over here? This little pod of the Tuggles right over here. Yeah. Yeah. So Marvel Cinematic Universe is this sort of amazing product of Marvel that's made to date 18 movies. There are at least 5 more on the horizon. They've gleaned over $17 billion. They make all these live action or hero kind of action movies that just get the blood flowing, right? And get you all excited. And it's just phenomenal. They've broken all kinds of box office records and enlivens us to get excited about possibilities and positive opportunities and wonderful things that could be possible if we might just kind of put our minds to it. And the Black Panther, as the sort of most recent one, there's still one yet to come this year, but it's the most recent one, kind of gives us some phenomenal images of goodness. Now, I know that clip made it difficult to find that, but the reality is this movie in particular, like all the movies we've chosen, actually has a deep theological root to it, has a pretty profound biblical message to it. And so our goal, of course, in all of these services is to pull that out, to remind us of that and help us to glean that goodness, right? And so that's going to be the challenge before us this morning. But my gut tells me, having done this twice already, that it's easier than we may imagine. Though if we've watched it and wondered at the end, wow, what's the church going to do with that message? Or how are they going to do that? Well, that's why we're here today, right? That's why we're here today. So, part of what we know about all the Marvel movies is that they're fictional, right? I mean, can we all own that, right? They're all fictional. There's not a one of them that's real, and that's clearly true for Black Panther. It's about an African nation named Wakanda on the continent of Africa. It's about a king, a kingly ruler who needs to determine who he is and what this nation is all about and what his purpose is. But the whole thing is fictional. But it's amazing when you put a microphone in somebody on the street what they might imagine about a fictional nation called Wakanda. Well, we ran across a video of just that very thing called Live Witness News, where people are asked what their impressions are of this nation called Wakanda. And this is what they had to say. Watch. The moral to that story, of course, is if somebody walks up to you on the street and puts a microphone in your face, say nothing, okay? Say nothing. Yeah. So it's amazing, even though this is all fictional, there's a real sense in which we connect with it, though, right? I mean, if you're a Marvel fan, you connect. You really get what's going on. And it started about a decade ago with Iron Man and has progressed into these 18 movies and now about 5 more on the horizon. And it's just fascinating how we can connect. And Black Panther helps on a lot of different levels, even though for some of us it might be a foreign concept because it's set on a foreign land, on a foreign continent, right? So it's all about this African nation named Wakanda. It has a kingly ruler. We don't have a king, right? I mean, so it's fascinating how even though there are a lot of differences, how there are some real commonalities as well. So there's this great African heritage, African culture. The anointing of the king was fascinating. T'Challa is the king's name. He follows after his father, who died surprisingly and through a tragedy, and he comes to power. And one of the scenes in the movie is fascinating as they go through some national rituals to sort of anoint him as king. And if you watched it, it was fascinating. Here's one reason it's fascinating. Number one, it's just kind of foreign to us because we have democratic elections, right? We don't anoint kings. But it's fascinating on another level because Wakanda, as a fictional nation, has both sort of the outback feel of some African nations, but then it's got this inner secretive nation that is highly advanced, that has high levels of education and a deep-seated economy based in a vibrant element known as vibranium. And that's what that man was referring to. And vibranium is this natural element that is the most costly element in the world, the strongest element in the world, and offers even healing capacities. They have this amazing ability to heal people with this vibranium. And so you've got sort of this clashing of cultures, old and new, and you've got this sort of sense in which it doesn't all click, and yet it's fascinating to watch. It's fascinating to get wrapped up in the way in which that nation of Wakanda can do amazing things. They're very self-sufficient. They're extremely self-determined. They are highly prosperous. They are in many ways exceptional on all levels. And the rest of the world just doesn't get it as you watch the movie, right? Because they think they're a traditional small African country. But they're actually, in the movie, highly advanced, have all kinds of opportunities. And what they begin to discover is, man, there's more to this world than us. They begin to recognize that there might actually be some suffering going on in the world, because in their nation, there is no suffering. There are no problems. There is no tragedy. There are only educated people. It's like Garrison Keillor's world all over again, right? And so when you watch the movie, you begin to wonder, so what is this about? And I'd like to propose that there's some deeply biblical imagery here. I'd like to propose that there's actually a deeply spiritual message that's very profound and yet extremely simplistic. Here's what I want to propose. If you haven't already pulled out your sermon notes, whether on the TMUMC app or in the worship bulletin, I want to encourage you to do so. I believe there are two fundamental questions that Black Panther addresses. And they're both very simple and yet deeply, deeply spiritual. Here's the first question. So the first question that I believe that the movie presupposes that we all need to answer is this: who are we? And by the way, I want to suggest that Ryan Coogler, who's the director of this movie, he says this very thing, that there are two fundamental questions that the movie answers or addresses. And this is the first: who are we? So the Wakandans have to ask the question, who are we? We're an extremely advanced nation. We have access to all kinds of financial opportunities. We're highly educated. We're very prosperous. We've got all things going for us. But what does it mean then for us to be this nation? And how is it we're supposed to live into that? And in particular, King T'Challa needs to address the question, who is he? Who is he as the king? Who is he as the son of T'Chaka? And how is it that he's to be this new kingly ruler? And he doesn't really get it. And he doesn't understand who they are. Notice that the question is not singular, who am I? The question is plural, who are we? That's where it becomes applicable to you and me. Because see, we're followers of Christ, we're individuals, but we can't follow Jesus unless we do it collectively. We clearly can have a private moment with Jesus. We can clearly have our individual devotions with Jesus. But as a follower of Jesus, we do it collectively. We do it in community. We do it together. And so the question is not only for the Wakandans, but for us. Who are we? Well, T'Challa has a kind of crisis. He discovers that his dad, the former king, is not as perfect as he had imagined. He discovers that he's actually done something pretty atrocious that has caused suffering and outcrying beyond the nation of Wakanda. And he has a dilemma about what he does with that information. Have you ever realized, if you happen to be a parent, have you ever recognized the moment that your kid realized you weren't perfect anymore? Wasn't that a fun moment? Yeah. Sometimes older childhood, sometimes young adolescence. Up until that point, they have idolized you. They have believed you are perfect. You make no errors. You can do no wrong. You make all things right and well, right? And then at some point, they realize, really? That's my mom or that's my dad? Well, T'Challa comes to this recognition as an adult, and you can well imagine that the later that recognition happens, the harder the fall, right? So I want to encourage you to watch this brief clip from the movie where T'Challa comes to this recognition and he has to determine, who am I as the new king? Watch. You can't let your father's mistakes define who you are. I would put that just a little further and say, you can't let your mistakes define who you are. We are more than any one mistake. We are more than the collection of our mistakes. But we've got to determine, what kind of person are we? Who are we? Well, T'Challa followed a human king, his dad. He was a human king. But we, as followers of Jesus, we follow a different king, right? And as your notes indicate, we do follow a king who is perfect, Jesus. Jesus Christ, made in the image of God, just like you and I. He is God's child, and he is perfect, and he offers us the opportunity to live into that. We will never literally be perfect, but we will be able, as best we can in all of our humanity, to become his follower, to live into his teachings, and to help others know of his love. That's our goal. That's who we are, right? Made in the image of God, a follower of Jesus. And in part what that means is we've got to discover this reality. Paul, the apostle, will describe it on a couple different levels. When Paul writes to the church at Corinth in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, he talks about when you become a follower of Jesus, the old has passed. There's a new creation. There's a new person there. So whether you accepted Jesus as a young child or a youth, or whether you accepted Jesus for the very first time last week, you become new. You become different. You are not your own. In writing to another collection of churches in the region of Galatia, Paul would say this in Galatians chapter 2. He would say, my old self has been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Jesus. And so part of what we've got to recognize is if indeed we're followers of Jesus, then we are his followers in the way in which we live his ways out, right? The problem is we're all human. We're all selfish. I'll own that. I want my own way. I want to make my own choices. I want to make my own decisions. I want to do it all the way I want to do it. But Jesus says to us, if you want to be my follower, first deny yourself, then take up the cross, then come follow me, right? And so part of what we understand, as your notes indicate, is that when we belong to Jesus, we are no longer our own. We are not who we want to be. We are who he wants us to be. And if indeed we are who he wants us to be, we belong, as your next note indicates, we belong to Christ and to others because that's who he calls us to be. He calls us to that claim that this life is not our own and we are not our own, but we belong to him and we give ourselves to others. That's what Jesus meant when Paul wrote it down to the church at Philippi in Philippians chapter 2. He just said, in our lives, you must think and act like Christ. Paul would go on to say, even though he was like God, even though he had the capacity of God, even though he had to do everything God could do, he humbled himself, put himself on a cross, and he did that for others, right? And in doing that for others, he gave us the example that we are to try to live as best we can. Thank God we have this perfect king who gives us a better example, who won't have those frailties and faults, but who allows us to be fully human even while we try to follow him. So our identity is we're followers of Jesus. And as followers of Jesus, we've got to answer the second question, right? First question is, who are we? We're followers of Jesus. We love others, we sacrifice for others, we give ourselves for others, we follow in his footsteps. That's who we are. But the second question becomes even more difficult. If who we are is important, then the second question is, what's our responsibility? What are we to do about this? What are we to do with this? The Wakandans had that question as well. We have all this prosperity. We have all this vibranium. We have all this opportunity. We have all this economic strength. We have all this intellectual property. We have all this possibility in front of us. What are we to do with it? And in general, if you watch the flick, you recognize that what they did with it was took care of themselves. That's what people who are well-heeled tend to do, right? We take care of ourselves because we kind of like ourselves and we kind of like the way life is. They are the most technologically advanced, wealthy nation in the world. Sound like any nation you know? Sounds like one with whom we're well familiar, right? And so it begins to sort of come at us like, okay, so what do we do about this? What do we do with this? What is this all about? Well, it's not really about a nation. It's about followership in Jesus. It's about how is it that we live into this obligation or this responsibility. The Wakandans began to discover in a very difficult way that there were actually people out there who suffer, that there are other nations that don't have it quite as nicely, that there are other cultures that aren't quite as well heeled or well trained or well educated. What do we then do about that? Well, it hit him smack dab in the face. If you watch the movie, you may recall that T'Challa's cousin had been living in the midst of that squalor, and he discovered he wanted in on the Wakandan way. He didn't want to suffer anymore. He didn't want other people to suffer anymore. He wanted Wakanda to take care of that. And so there's a clash, right? He comes, he takes over from King T'Challa, and he begins to show them a different way that really bothers everybody. But it does get at the deeper question, what then is our responsibility? What are we to do about these that are different from us? So in the next clip, T'Challa comes to a recognition as he gets ousted from power that he needs to discover what his role is. What is his obligation? He has a rather spiritual encounter with his father in a dream. Watch as he discovers what his and then the Wakandans' responsibility ought to be. Watch. Must right this wrong. A part of what T'Challa began to recognize was his responsibility was to help those in need. His responsibility was to help those who were suffering. His responsibility was to right a wrong that had happened so long ago but had long-lasting and broad impact on others. To me, it sort of begs the question, so if we are followers of Jesus, what is our responsibility? And I believe, as your notes indicate, that our responsibility as a follower of Jesus is to help others. Jesus spent his entire life helping others, spiritually, physically, emotionally, financially. He helped people on so many different levels. And a part of what it means for those of us who are well-heeled ourselves, who live in our own kind of Wakanda, whether spiritually or nationally, is that we ought to help other people. Jesus put it this way. Luke's gospel records it in Luke chapter 12. He says, to those that have been offered much, much is required, right? And if there's more to come, then even more will be demanded. And so part of our understanding is, man, we've been given a lot. We've been given opportunities. We've been given possibilities. We've been given faith in Christ, life everlasting, and we need to help others encounter that. The possibility goes even further when James, one of the apostles, said in his letter in chapter 1, look, do what God's teaching says. When you only listen and do nothing, you're fooling yourself. We've got to do what Scripture says, not just think about it, not just ponder it, not just wonder, gosh, is this the right thing to do? But actually go do something about it. Help those in need. The further thing I believe strongly, as your notes indicate, is we cannot then, therefore, sit idly by while others suffer. We just can't. Some of us do that, myself included, because we think, golly, there's so much suffering, or there's so much tragedy, or there's so much to be corrected. What can I possibly do? What can my role possibly be? And I just want to suggest that we can't do nothing simply because we can't do everything. But rather we ought to do something in order that there might be some relief somehow, some way. You know, Jesus put it this way when he got up in the temple. Luke's gospel records it in Luke chapter 4. He read from the prophet Isaiah. He read to the people. He said, look, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed. And he said, look, this has happened in your hearing this very day. If we are followers of him, we're called to do the same. And the challenge for us is to set our Wakandan way aside and find out ways that we can live into the powerful gift of knowing who we are and how it is we can live into that responsibility. Well, in the movie, T'Challa finally recognizes it. After much battling with self and with others, after a discovery of self and recognition that he needs to do more, he actually takes charge of it. So watch as he, at the very end of the movie, begins to live into who he is and his own responsibility. Watch. Friends, the world is watching, and they're asking of us, that is to say, those who follow Jesus, who are you? And what is your role? Now, we can't all buy buildings, and we can't solve all issues, but we can feed children in our neighborhood, and we can hammer nails on a new home, and we can help other people do the very same thing. We've all got a role. We've all got a responsibility. You know, when our days are final, we will enter into what's known as judgment. And most of us think of judgment as a very negative thing, and most of us don't want judgment at all, but I would like to propose to you and suggest to you that scripturally, judgment can actually be a very positive thing. Jesus talks about it in Matthew chapter 25. And in Matthew 25, he describes what judgment might look like. And in part, he is very clear and he says, look, when you feed the hungry and clothe the naked and give drink to the thirsty and visit those who are in prison and take care of those who are sick, and the list, of course, could go on, but that's where he finishes. He says, you've done it to me. And when you've done that, Jesus says, you will enter into your eternal home, and that will be your judgment. That is in part right here on your notes. And I want to encourage you to read Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46 when you go home today, because it's the standard by which we will be judged. And I don't know about you, but my hope is that when I get to that door and when I face God face to face, and God says, what did you do? My prayer is that I will be able to say, I followed Jesus and I helped other people. I haven't done a very good job, and my goal is to get better at that. But what I want to hear, and my hunch is what you want to hear on that great and final day, is well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your eternal rest. And I believe the way we will do that is by claiming who we are and by owning up to our responsibility as followers of Jesus. Will you pray with me? Holy and loving God, thank you for the gift of life and of love, and for the opportunity we have to share that with others. God, help us this day and the next to realize who and whose we are. And by doing so, God, help us to own the responsibility of what it means to be a faithful follower of Jesus. God, you are so wonderful and so loving. We get that. We just need to offer that more often to others. Give us courage and give us that hope that we might share it as well. This is our prayer, God, and we lift it in the name of Jesus. Amen.